Hello, all at the Academy. Marc Daniel Nelson here. Wanted to talk to you guys this week about something I've had a few emails from certain people in the Academy about my template and how I prepare my sessions usually, and what entails my template to be so expansive. Why is it so big? And why do I use such an enormous template? So today, I decided to do a pre-record for you guys on the expansive side of prepping my session, what I do, why I color things certain ways, why I label things certain ways. Because, in all honesty, everything comes down to being organized and efficient. As a recording engineer, as a mixer, as a producer, as a creative, we come into this full on knowing that things can go out of whack quickly, that things are usually gauged emotionally, creatively, and to never trust something to happen the same way twice. So for me, as a mixer, and as a perfectionist, and as someone that takes quite a bit of time to get things right the first time, I built this entire template over the course of like 3 or 4 years so that everything falls into play and I can spend way more time listening to the music, worrying about the music than about auxes and outputs and where certain tracks are, what happened to them. That being said, I wanted to start from complete scratch on a session and just walk through why and how I set up my projects. Usually I have 2 guys that do this for me so I can go in hard as a mixing perspective, meaning what I'll show you today is usually done by one of my assistants, a prepper, essentially, that knows the system, the colors, and has my template in line that they can follow and set up a specific session based around that. Philosophy-wise, for me, I like to build a session very simply off of a specific template that can be updated at any time and usually has. I think this template now is at like 40 something. That's how many versions I've made over the last couple years of it. And usually I'll find something I like and I'll add on to it, and then I'll take something out, or there's a send going weird, dumping into the wrong stem or something like that. So over the years it just accumulates a lot of problems and makes it as efficient as we can build it. I like to make sure that my final stereo is running in real time. I don't do bounce to disc, even if I'm mixing completely in the box. My stems are always running at the exact same time as the stereo. So at any time I can see the stereo mix and all of the stems from the songs. And for me, the stems are essentially the groups. And for me, the stems or the groups are the same as the colors are for the groups. So I like to keep things consistent and easy. So further ado, I'm going to start from scratch and show you exactly why and what my template entails and how I benefit from that in general. Let's pretend I just loaded this entire project, which is this artist I just started working with in Australia, from scratch. So if I loaded his entire project that he recorded at a couple different studios, drums at a studio and another studio that doesn't run Pro Tools, they ran Logic. So they sent me audio files as WAV files. And what I did was, and I didn't want to spend a terrible amount of time doing this live because I want to spend more of my time showing you certain aspects of why I do it. I group each instrument into banks, essentially. So if you can see, my drums are here, grouped, my percussion's here. For this song, they printed a lot of the vocal throws and the delay effects and stuff, so I put those into my effects, bass, We've got acoustic guitars. We've got electric guitars. We have keyboards like piano, organ, stuff like that. Lead synthesizer, synth, orchestra stuff, so strings. I do have a brass bucket. I do have a woodwind bucket. I have leads for those as well, which I will get into. But for this album and this project, it's just like mellotron stuff and some violin soloing stuff. So I grouped those all together. We have a little more texture guitar stuff here that I'm going to find out what that really is. In fact, let me just listen. Okay, so I'm going to pull this up to the other stuff because I'm not sure why that was down there. And then it gets into the lead vocals, background vocals, and then at the end, at the bottom, is the ref mix. I always label and color my ref brown. It's a habit. I started as a joke calling the ref mix poop, and it's stuck. But that got me into starting to color specific groups, specific colors. And a lot of it is so I can move around very quickly and know exactly where I'm at. This isn't a you need to do this kind of video. This is more for people to try to understand a philosophy and maybe build off of that on their own. They can utilize some of these ideas. There's no way rules. It's just this is how I got to do it. My mind works weird sometimes. I don't learn things properly the way a lot of people do. It takes me a lot longer to learn things properly than a lot of people. So my system might be a little weird for some people, but for me it's incredibly efficient and accurate. So once the session is set up, I can come back in 2 years and I would know just by the color where I'm at. I'll know by the outputs where I'm at, and the stems will be all locked specifically to that. We're in a time period now that a lot of labels, if you're doing any kind of placement music for films or TV, they don't want just instrumental anymore. They want stems. And also, I break my stems out in a way that I can turn it into an immersive mix or an Atmos mix or a 360 Sony mix. This allows me to have complete control at any time. As well, that if I'm on vacation or something like that, I can go back into my Google Drive and see that I have all my stems. And if they need some kind of ridiculously quick edit, after it's already printed or whatever, I can just edit the stem, send it to them, and then send them the final full if they have a few days before I get back. It's just a fail-safe thing for me to always have access to it. And again, it's running at all times. So anytime I print a mix, the stems are going with it. It's really cool, really efficient, and quite complex, which is what today's video is for. So after I grouped everything, you can see my color codes are very consistent. I want to go back and do the outputs. Now what these outputs are going to do is it's going to fold into, let's say, 19 different stereo buckets. These buckets are my stems, but they're also kind of basic buses, stereo buses for the groups. So I do a lot of processing on those sections versus doing it on the tracks. Doesn't mean I don't work on the tracks. It's just I've just gotten in the hand of going, oh, this whole group of guitars seems to be a little bright. Instead of putting 36 EQs across the board, I can just kind of focus and round stuff off there. It's kind of a quick way of moving around, and it lets me mix really, really fast. Now, before I load in the template, I just want to again talk about the colors. Sometimes you get a multitude of things. So in my analog process, which I will talk about summing, these three guys are still going into one analog bus. My template's set up where I have a digital and an analog going, and it's alted. So I have a mult out depending on what bus I'm going in. It's essentially laid out where all the way down to the decibel that I can toggle on my master, my analog summing chain, or the digital. And that will allow me to set everything up efficiently where I can do analog and then my stems print full digital at all times. I do have a specific amount of pieces of gear that I use, specifically like this TubeTech compressor or the API summing that I have that has actual API 550s on 8 channels. The Fairchild, stuff like that I use specifically all the time. My hardware Bricasti. These are all hardware stuff that when you hit stems, the hardware is not going to be hit. So I had to find digital counterparts that were identical to do the exact same thing. And I'll get into that once I load the template in. So let's load in the template. After everything is grouped, and before I do the outputs to send into the buses, I will just import the session data into my project. This is version 40. It's quite a lot. And in this session data, I have everything set aside except for virgin tracks. So all the groups of the stereo buses, all the reverbs, the stereo master, and then all my stem prints. As well, I do have some kick, snare, trigger, tom stuff, but rarely do I even grab those. I do like to use the window configuration because I have that set. So at any time, I know I can just hit on my UF8 Marvin, which essentially is my joke name, to reset the screen to where it's at. So if I have one of my prepper guys prepping the session on a smaller monitor, or he has 2 monitors, I can just hit my preset of the window configuration and it will always reset to what I want it to be. You guys look into that. That's a really cool, quick way to get things rocking. Now, as this takes a bit of time, because this session is so huge, the actual template is enormous. It takes quite a bit of time, maybe a minute, minute and a half to load in all of the plugins, all of the reverbs, because you got to remember my reverbs are doubled, tripled, quadrupled depending on the buses, and I will get into that. And on top of that, there's a lot of plugins already inactivated but ready to go, just so I have things in order. Now I'm getting down to the stems for import, and then it will import from here, and I will show you from ground up, soup to butts, soup to bolts. How do you say it? Everything that you can see, so you can understand how I lay everything out. Once it gets imported, I will do the outputs on all the groups to the buses, and then I will show you the common line that goes from how this goes from the stereo to a summing, that goes to a reverb, that goes to the hardware reverb at the same time, that goes to the stereo print and its counterpart stem. Okay. I'm sure you guys have seen quite a bit in all the videos this template. It is quite a lot of stuff. If you see the yellow, essentially is the buses I was referring to. That will be the stems. After that, you can see my 2 analog reverbs. I have a real EMT 250 and I have a real Bricasti here. The way these are set up, I will show you in the future how I do that. And then after that are all my in-the-box reverbs. These are attached, as you see, to the buses. So the drum reverbs are here, percussion reverbs are here, acoustic guitar reverb, all these different things. These are different from the Bricasti sound. So if you look at it, it's like the 480 or the Abbey Road plate or the Pro R long reverb that I really like. And then just random stuff below it that I can toggle through. So if I didn't like on the acoustic guitar the Abbey Road plate, I would just minimize that and try something different. Essentially, it allows me to switch out reverbs depending on where I want. On my acoustic guitar, I have a couple different reverbs here, but it's still staying in the acoustic guitar reverb because what it does is it sends that reverb to the acoustic guitar bus. Each bus has its own group of reverbs, essentially. And I have it laid out where I can toggle between those. If I open up the acoustic guitar way down in my bus here, it goes reverb acoustic guitar, which was the exact bank I was just showing you, and then that folds down into the acoustic guitar bus. As well, each one of these has a Bricasti send that goes to the absolute analog version and the Seventh Heaven plugin. Now the Seventh Heaven plugin, if I open up, and let's do that. Okay, so the Seventh Heaven plugin, I have bridging as well as the hardware Bricasti, and it goes like this. Pretty simple. Let's say acoustic guitar Bricasti. I send, let's put even a little bit of tone here. Let's bring it way down. Okay. Instantly, it sends to this area right here. That goes and splits it to the hardware and to the software. Here it is sending it to the hardware, and here it is sending it to the Seventh Heaven plugin. Now my hardware is set at Sunset Chamber, which it is here, 2.35 seconds, and I can check that in the session by going to the analog side, which is here, and looking at the M7 link, and there it is, 2.35 second decay. This is the exact setting as the Seventh Heaven. And what this does is that all my buses have their own Bricasti send. They're all labeled. Here's the guitar. Let's open up the synth. Here's the synth. They're all labeled. So essentially, every bus has its own Bricasti sound. If I'm dumping into the analog, it's the stereo mix anyways, so the analog gets all of the stereo and it all combines there. If it branches out, which is why we put this brancher here, to the plugin counterpart, that counterpart goes to the stem, as you see here, each one. I know it's a little confusing, but just think of it as this. Think of it as I've got a stereo mix with analog stuff, and I've got my stems with the analog digital counterpart of the analog doing the same thing. And it needs to be separated, where each reverb needs to go in its own stem, or you would hear snare reverb in the vocal stem, which is why you have to separate each thing. So it makes the sessions huge sounding. I mean, look at this. We're almost at 150, 152 before I even hit the stereo. Now going into the EMT 250, I have the same process here going. So here's the analog guy, but I'm only having a couple of sends with the real 250. I have it on the main vocal, I have it on acoustic guitar, and on drums. Those are really the only three buses I'm going to really be using the EMT 250 for. It's either a snare drum, the drum set in general, the vocal, or the acoustic guitar. And that's pretty much it. So if you look at that expansive side, you've got 3 tracks here, splitting it the same way we did the Bricasti. So one goes to the real EMT 250 and one goes to the real, or the one that goes to the actual plugin. And as you can see, after that we have these 3 guys doing their own thing that will dump into their own stem as well. All falling in future into that place. This one's a little different, so I will set it depending on what I need it to be on the hardware and then just group send it. So if I look at keeping it a 3-second delay, it's cloning itself times 3. And essentially, I hide this entire bank all the way down to the splitters of both the reverbs. I don't inactivate, I just hide it because it's all set up and ready to go. But if I want to do a recall and I got to go, what is the real plate? This guy in the session, all I have to do is just inactivate it or just bypass it. And if I move anything here, the parameters go with the actual stems as well. So all I have to really do is move one reverb setting from the real guy And then this is basically repeating itself in the digital LAN. I know it's confusing, but just again, think of it as, you know, just the counterpart and for stems, and how you have to separate every little thing for stems, and each little thing has to fall into their own banks. So each one of these auxes were all properly labeled. Time and time again, I had mistakes where I would have a guitar solo going, reverb going into the lead vocal because I made a mistake somewhere along the line of sending that, and it cross sent it to the vocal. So it took a very long time to do it. But in reality, if I'm sending this tone at -18, at -12, if I go all the way down and I look at my stem acoustic guitar, this is the print through, and then if I inactivate or activate the print, you see the stem print there. Here's the print through though. So what you're seeing here is a combination of cloned plugins from my master bus. This is my stems again. So think of it as on my master bus, along with the analog stuff, I am doing a bit of things here and there consistently. And I always have it open, knowing what I'm going to do it. So the Savitar is my Lavery plugin. So that's coming. Let's go from this area real quick, because this is where it starts getting a little confusing. If you look at my buses, drums through lead vocals, the outputs have a plus sign. The plus sign means it's multed. There's two outputs going on. One of them is going to the mix, which is the digital mix bus, and then the other one is going output, if I look for it, to the place that it needs to be on the analog side of the chain. So it might take a couple seconds to find that specific output, but essentially, if you see here, guitar out analog is the guitar on my summing. I have 8 channels of vintage API summing, 2, 4, 6, 8. That's 4 separate stereo buses. I'm grouping a handful of things into each stereo. It's going through that with EQs on at all times, which is just 2 at top, 2 at the bottom, 10K, 50K, or 50 hertz. Always on so I can mix into that sound, going into a compressor of my choice, and then coming back into the master. The way I have this set up, my master is just right here on an insert. So if I take it off, you see instantly there's the tone. If it's on, that means it's going through all my analog chain, which I don't have on today. But if it was on, you would see that it would go all the way through. So just feel this as a through point. Take that out completely, we're in digital LAN. Now underneath that, we're going back into what I was explaining, which was the ATR 101 or the ATR 102, which is what this is on my stereo. If I'm using it, you can see the tone is on. It's also activating everything in the stem print through to the prints of the stem. So every track is also getting the ATR 101. And if you see, let's just turn that all the way down. It does it on everything. Because essentially, all I wanted to do is to mimic what it's doing on the stereo. So if I'm adjusting anything on the stereo, I just wanted to apply itself to all the stems as well. The API 560 I only use as a line amp. I don't clone that in here because I'm actually using the 550 EQ. And if you see, the 550 EQ, which is always on, is set at 2 dB, 50 hertz, 2 dB, 10K. Everything else is set accordingly. I send tone to make sure everything is set compatible to the analog. So essentially, I'm getting the same sound on my stems from the summing with this guy. Going down on the stereo again, I've got the ozone, which if I do any changes here, it's going to reflect here. And then I have two choices of limiters, but right now I'm going after the limitless, which is on my main stereo, and it's doing the exact same thing here. So if I look at this guy, there's the tone. That's the stem acoustic. And if I fall this down, there it is there. Now if you see on the master, I'm hitting digital 0 here. But on the print of the stem, there's a reason behind that. And that's going down to the trim here. And I'm actually taking 6 dB off just because for... There's Atticus is sleeping. You can hear him snoring. My -6 on all the stems is after its post limiter. The reason why I'm doing that is for music editors and stuff. They like it loud. They like to make sure it sounds the same as the stereo. But they hate the fact that they always have to turn it down. So I always just bring it down right away. -6, but it's still applying the limiting. So essentially all you have to do is bring it up to -6 and it's limited. Okay. If I turn this off, if I go back to the stereo, I can turn off the signal generator and we can start talking about where certain things are going to go before we have a chance to listen to anything. If you see here, these are the inputs for the buses. They're already pre-labeled. And they're actually virtually the same as what my groups would be. Maybe off a little bit, but it's pretty easy to know where we're supposed to go. If I'm doing anything large film-wise, I have a woods stem. I have a short brass, which is like really short note stuff. Long brass, which is long, same as the string stuff. Short, which is pizzicato stuff, and long strings, which is long, beautiful stuff. They really like to separate that stuff. And frankly, pretty much 90% of the time now orchestras record that way, where they'll do a pass of just short and a pass of long. And that gives you the freedom in the stem process to balance each area. Or create new mixes depending on the version. Because a lot of trailers now are being made musically of 3 or 4 different music pieces combined. So the music editor could take the long strings in the key of A off this piece and the drums off this completely different music part that was done across the world with a different composer, totally unrelated, and combine the two. And at the end, the trailer has 6 or 7 writers on it, all the way down to the background vocals and the lead vocals. So let's assign each bucket bus into its own spot. Very simply, I just do select and then I group these by the search. So it's drums, done. This is percussion, same thing, done. Now I'm hitting Shift and Option when I'm doing the group output, so I can do it all in one pass. So I can just hit this, and then this will be effects, done. I know some people just say type. I have this constant problem of not having to hit search when I actually want to actually hand do it. So in reality, I can just really just go like this and start typing, but it doesn't work like that. So I can do hands-free and just hit AC, and that goes into AC guitars. Same with all the way down to the guitars. If this was a bigger, elaborate session for a film or something, I would probably break this down to even more lead versus just electric. But since this is an album cut, one group of electric, one group of acoustic is fine. So I will just put this into my guitar bus. Down to, just by seeing the color, I don't even have to think about it. I know that that's keys. And that makes things super easy and efficient. Down to, now the one thing I can definitely say is this is the synth just by the color. This is the synth lead just by the color, which I have one group called key synth lead because it's usually one or the other. 99.9% always one or the other for lead stuff. And then here is the strings. Now instead of going and breaking this out into long, short, and solo, again, this is an album cut, so I'll just dump it all into long strings. And then this guy is the guitar again, which we need to move up. So let's just pull this up to its other area. And then get the vocals sent. Lead vocals go into LD Vox. Then BGVs go into BGVs. Before we go, we got to remember there's a ref mix there too. At the very bottom of the session, I will bring this all the way up, just right below the stereo print. I should have a track that's called ref. I drag that in here, and that one's ready to go too. Sometimes, like today, I will put the reference into the stereo print, because what that does, allows me to do, is toggle the input in and out. So if I'm in the middle of a mix, I can go in and out. But if I was off this video, I could actually do that with the ref out on my monitor controller. But since the video won't capture me going between the two, I will just toggle in and out here for now. In reality, as I have the summing off, I can turn off these other plugins. It's looking like things are pretty good. Sometimes I forget and I don't output a bus and it's just labeled out. That's a problem, because what that does is it skips these guys and it actually skips the master, and it just plays with this, because this is sharing the output. It doesn't print with it. So there's times I'll get notes going, we're missing the guitar here. And I'm like, well, how is that possible? I heard it. It's because I heard it, but it wasn't printing, because it wasn't going through the proper bus system. Now that everything is set up, before I even listen to anything, which I will mute here, I just want to play it and see where we're at. I can already see that we're over. So what I want to do is bring down the entire project clip gain wise, just enough where we're hovering a little under like -4. Let me look at the stereo again after I pulled that down. Okay, so we're still hitting hard. So there's some peaks there in the drums or whatever it is. That's definitely slamming up hot. Okay, that looks a little better. I could probably come back up to 7. I'll give it a little more. But this allows me the headroom I need when I go to summing. It also allows me to not over squeeze some of the plugins, because even though if I'm running at 24 or even 32, sometimes these plugins respond very goofy when it comes down to pushing too much bottleneck into the plugins itself. Before we listen to it, I can show you a little bit about all these plugins here and a little bit about these sends. I know I've talked a little bit about it, but let's go into it a little more. Usually, when I get a session, I have everything ready to go. This is kind of the place I get it from a prepper. This allows me to basically sit down, not know what I'm listening to, turn on the reference mix, which I'll do on the input here, and listen to the song. So let's do that. This is the ref mix again.
I saw a bridge from afar, no telling how old you are. I hate to tear it apart when the snow melts down.
Drums are going to drums.
So we can't go that far.
Bass is going to bass. Electric guitar is going to electric guitar. Keys are going to keys.
Yes, I'm
Vocals are going to vocals. And the buses. the print through. This is what we're hearing track-wise.
Seek your confidence. Can you show me to your hand? Can you show me how to sense? Now no more calls to hurry home. I'm free to lay with my loneliness. There was no choice. I put it all back together. I saw that bridge from afar, and there's no cabin in town. A sinking leaving defeat, a crippled heart hardly beats. A little rush in the car, a pretty missing guitar, and in those notes there you are. There you are. Now no more calls to hurry home.
I also have a rep as my output on stems, but they're muted because I never want to listen to it. Because if I started listening to it with the rep, there's a time delay thing going on. So if I wanted to check it, I would mute the rep and then open this up, and then there would be a little bit of time delay between the stereo and all the stem moved out. Lots of cool sound design stuff happening. Love the drum
Found myself in a jar, stuck in this away. Found myself in a jar, stuck in this away. I found myself in a jar, and there were so many hearts, a couple legs in an arm, and a little girl.
If we listen just the drums. Great tones. Pretty simple. Kick snare, bottom snare for a little bit of the rattle, overheads. I can tell you right away. I like to do it the opposite way, the hi-hat's on the left. Just flat. It sounds great. I do start my mix trying to figure out phase and stuff between the kicks and snares and the overheads, which is why there's a cue here. This Q3 allows me to just go and okay, so it's recorded correctly, or at least to my preference. I can actually take that out of the room and try it again. It's not nearly as noticeable. So this is the room mic. It almost sounds like a crotch mic. It's going to be a lot of fun to mix. If we just listen to the drums and bass, going into the first batch of stereo. You'll see that it's not only dumping into the stereo, it's dumping into the stem in the groups. So anything I process on the drum bus will go into the stereo and the stems. Not rocket science, but can get really confusing very quickly. Now going into the layout. This is important. This is really important, at least for me. Going down to the color and the layout of the session. In general, if I look at it as a whole, if I go as small as I can go, I can't really see any of the waveforms, but I know where everything's at based around the groups of the colors. And the other thing is, as this project was recorded in Logic, or at least a lot of it was done there, comping and stuff, it ended up coming to me through that. The way that they export stuff is, let's say, exporting that, it will literally stop if there's nothing, no audio after that source. So it looks like this tam hit on the snare is just the first verse. So sometimes you might group everything together and it'd be all chaotic and stuff. Because I'm OCD and I like to be efficient and organized, I can tell you everything is in line compared to where it's at for the song, within reason. You can tell that for the group of acoustic guitars, this is where it starts, this is where second starts, and then the rest, and then that guy. Same as these guitar parts, actually, which I don't think I grouped correctly. This one would go around here, and then these guys would go here-ish. I mean, within reason. But it's enough for me to just get around the project to see where I'm at. So everything falls into play. You can see this thing where it's staring down. It just allows me, when I'm zoomed in, I know where things are at. They're not all over the place. Now for plugins and such, I do have a couple of random things to talk about. I do have a parallel track for my piano, a parallel track for my drum bus, and a parallel track for my vocal bus. I inactivate this until I need it, if I ever do need it. And if I do need it, I'll just pull it up in my template and it will pop up right after my main yellow buses. Just right here. But these are also going into the vocal, the key, and the drum bus. These are all separate for the way I like specific sounds for the drums, the vocal, and the drums, and the piano, and the drums. And did I say the drums? How about the drums? Piano, though, this guy, very special on piano. This guy, as a parallel piano compressor, is one of those sneaker things, at least for me. Take a screenshot of this if you have this Waves TG12345 plugin. It's EQ, and it's a limiter compressor. It's really fast. It has a specific sound, but in parallel piano, it's almost like a reminder of the past. It's so, for me at least, obvious what it sounds like. And in fact, let's just hear that for a second. Let's pull up the upright piano. So this guy, and then bring it in. Let's pull it down a little bit volume-wise. Now there is a little bit of a volume difference, but if I'm listening to it, what it's really doing is it's adding a little bit of top-end spank, but it's extending the notes in a clean way that the piano still has its body, but it still has that color of compression. Just fills it up really good. Same with the drums, same with the vocal. I do have the Devil Lock here because I love the way that this sounds on drum parallel. And this shapeshifter guy for drums is really one of my new favorites as well. It's kind of spooky. It's just weird. I don't even know what it really does. It just kind of makes things clunky and weird, which in my opinion parallel should be a little off because that's the whole point of pulling in stuff that's not naturally as beautiful and clean because you're trying to add some character without taking away certain things that weird stuff gives. Same as the vocals with the shapeshifter. I don't do a terrible amount of parallel. I know a lot of people like it. I don't like it a terrible amount because it does impart phase. It brings in phase. Just the relationship of certain things changes a little bit. There's a lot of guys that will base 80% of their entire mix process off of parallel. For me, it doesn't work that way very well. So I leave it off unless I feel like I'm missing some depth, some edge and punch and stuff like that. And then in the middle of a mix, I can just pop that in and it helps, or it doesn't. And I'll know quickly and I'll throw it out if it doesn't. In general, I'll leave you guys with this thought. This is a pretty small project when it comes down to it. But at the same time, it kind of goes over every aspect of all the instruments. Sometimes I get stuff that's 3 times this size. A lot of trailer stuff, enormous sounding. 300 tracks for a pop track. It gets really critical at being organized and your outputs being the same. I just like the idea of being able to know what each thing is without trying to remember what bus 2 or 14 is. Going into my reverbs again, which is all in green. You can see here, I've talked about this earlier, that each guy has its own feel. So if I look at my percussion stereo stem, actually let's look at the drum set. We have drum room, we have drum 480, which is a couple different choices of reverbs, but right now it's drum reverb. And then the long drum hit, which is like these 8-second decay reverbs. If you check out my drum stereo, here they are up here. They're always on here. My problem in the past was I used to take one, and if I liked the way it sounded and I wanted to put it on, let's say the bass or something, I would just drag it over. But what happens here? If I do that, and I put reverb on the bass guitar, that's going to send the reverb of the drums, or put the bass into the reverb of the drums thing, which means that you're going to hear the bass guitar on the drum stem. It's a bad habit. I had to figure out a way to break it, which is why I ended up naming all these reverbs on their own and let them stay. I'm not moving them around. Like on the guitar, there's quite a bit of reverbs. We've got reverb guitar, which is a handful of different choices there. We have the spring, which is its own thing. We have the long, which is its own big thing. And then we have one delay guitar send that goes into the H delay. And then the Bercasti. Again, allowing me to do exactly the little things I need to set around and make sure. So if I go into here, and I see 1, 2, 3, 4 reverbs here, all going into the stem guitar. But reverb guitar can be a handful of different reverbs, depending on which one I like. The long reverb is usually always this Pro Air. My spring reverb is one of these two guys. I just like the sound of this guy. I know it's not necessarily 100% accurate or incredibly sexy because it's quite an old plugin. But I just like the way it does that. I mean, goofy side of things. It's got a sound. And most of the time I'll send it and I'll hard pan that to the left or right, depending on the opposite side of the guitar. And then here's the delay. I used to have a bunch of different delays on the actual guitar send, but I found that for me, when I want to send delay, it's usually the H delay for easy. Just universally, I like the way it sounds. I love a lot of different delay plugins. I love tape echo, but for the send, I'll just keep it simple for that. And if I want to put any kind of tape delay echo or anything that I'm going to use as an aux or automation, I will put either directly on the stereo bus or I'll put it directly on the track itself, which will always fall down into the stereo master and the stems either way. Other than that, I think overall this is pretty much it. If you can again see, all the reverbs are sending out between the mix, which is the digital that falls into here, or multed to the analog counterpart. And I only have 8 channels for my analog. It used to be 24 summing, and then I did 16 summing. And I did this experiment where I was testing the difference between 16 and 24, and there wasn't a huge amount of change sonically. I started thinking, okay, do I really need 16, or can I go down to 8? And can I try 8 versus 2? So I spent quite a bit of time listening to the depth, because that's, in my opinion, summing in general is more about the space it's adding and allowing, and some of the headroom where it feels like it's a lot less clamped down. And what I found was, at least for the API, that the difference between 16 and 8 are very, very, very small. But the difference between the 8 and the 2, meaning if I just sent everything into 2 channels, it was not even close to the same. So there was a sweet spot there with 8. So I figured, okay, I can put, let's see, I can tell you right now what is what on my IL for the stereo. So my stereo is the output, which is what we're monitoring, the drums, which is the channel 1 and 2 on the API, bass, guitar, keyboards out is on 2 and 3. I feel because keyboards and organs and stuff like that usually doesn't have anything subsonic, 99%. So I feel combining those two things worked really well. Guitars, acoustic guitars and lead guitars are going in 5 and 6. And then at the end, orchestra, vocals, and synth. I feel because synth does have some low end stuff and low mids, and vocals usually doesn't have anything terrible below 80 hertz. Those work well together, and that orchestras usually, if the vocals aren't going, if I'm just doing a project that's instrumental or a score thing, for the output, for summing those 3 groups into one channel works really well together too. This was another thing that I took quite a bit of time experimenting on sonics, of going, okay, can I put drums and bass on its own analog stereo? Or can I put guitars with the vocal? These groups of instruments totaling each other seems to be the proper way of doing it. And then once I'm in analog mode, I can insert the pickup converter after it sends it to all the toys, and it falls in. By putting it here, this allows me to put plugins in real time after the input of out-of-the-box mixing. So I can still use the stuff that I really like the ATR or the 560, which is funny because I'm using a freaking vintage 8 channels with something like 24 channels or 24 transformers and 24 op amps in 8 channels. Just a ton of color and character on a sidecar, but I still like the way that this sounds. So I have it in my master bus. I don't use it all the time, but I have it here, and really don't touch the EQ. Maybe a little bit here and there I'll tap it, but I really don't like to touch it. I just use it as the modeled op amp, and I feel like that can stretch the drum sound or whatever it's being mixed just a little bit more in depth. So I have that always in, and again down to the ozone and then my limiter. That prints into my master. So let's say we have a mix going. I'll give you an idea. Let's hit record. Okay. Stereo is going. And the stems are going. All at once.
I saw a bridge from afar, no telling how old you are. I hate to tear it apart, and the snowman
Song ends. Now I have all of the stems and the stereo locked. And if I need to send everything out, I can literally go ungroup, and I usually slam it just so I can see what's in there, because sometimes if it's small like this, I can't see, and I go, oh, there's nothing in the effects track, which obviously there is. So I usually expand it as loud as I can go, ungroup everything, and just delete the stuff that I don't need right off the bat. Right off the bat. This allows me to keep things clean and efficient. Obviously, there was some vocals and stuff in there, but we didn't get the whole song. If I regroup, this gives me access to select only the stems, and then I can name the track. Once I put this out, I will have a folder here called MIP1, and I will export the whole thing, which is Shift Command K, export it at 2448. I send it to that folder. If you open up the folder, let me first save the song name. If I open up that folder, you can see relatively quickly that I didn't name everything, but instead of renaming everything by itself, I can right click the whole guy, hit rename, and then the name of the song. And now I have the whole song stemmed out and printed. If I don't want the 01 at the end, I can just do this. Just file management, but it takes 10 seconds to really do everything. Honestly, it takes a good 20 minutes to do the whole album of prints of the whole album. It's pretty cool. Efficient, easy, and at any time I can go back if I'm in anywhere in the world and locate an issue, locate a problem just by loading in just the stems, do a quick edit, send it back, do some effects changes if I don't have the entire system with me, which has happened. It just happened when I was in Greece the other month. So efficiently, it allows me to keep everything going. And if I have to make alts, I can do it off the stems as well. So a non-vocal or a non-drum mix or whatever, I can quickly do that as well. That's pretty much it. In general, this is my template. It's pretty enormous. There's a lot going on, but what you do have is a massive amount of time to focus on the creative stuff, like reverbs, choosing drum samples, automation, all the stuff that you actually, at least for me, enjoy spending a lot of time doing, I can worry about, and less time about sitting there and printing each track as its own stem and hope it works out when you get it all together. It just seems to work, and I'm happy to share it. So if anyone really wants my template, I'm not totally sure you'll have every single plugin that I have, but in general you can see a layout. Send me an email. I'd be happy to send it to you. It's just way easier to do it that way. So in a nutshell, thank you again. As I say, nutshells. Thank you again for watching, and have a great time mixing.